Welcome back to the Social Worker Podcast and to our special series celebrating 100 years of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Throughout this series, we're highlighting social workers whose practice, values, and leadership reflect both the evolution of the profession and the future we're collectively working towards. I'm your host, Esther Fagbola, the Communications Coordinator at CASW, and today we're honored to be joined by Julia Falzarano, a registered social worker whose work centers grief, loss, holistic and compassionate care. It supports children, youth, families through individual counseling, workshops, and creative approaches to healing, including art and play, which we'll talk about as we go through our conversation. Her practice is deeply shaped by lived experience, systems level insight, and a commitment to making grief support more accessible and humane. Julia, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Esther. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Okay, thank you. So let's get into the conversation. So to start us off, Julia, if you could please introduce yourself to people who may not know who you are, sharing maybe how you discovered social work, what drew you to the profession, and to the holistic approach that social work offers.
Yeah, so my name is Julia Falzarano. I'm a registered social worker and the founder and clinical director at Willow Tree Wellness and Psychotherapy here in Pickering, Ontario. I work primarily with children, teens, families, and adults, as you mentioned, and there's a strong focus with grief and loss in our practice. So before entering social work, I spent about 5 or 6 years working in pediatric health and nutrition research. And while I really loved the research side, I knew that I wanted to return to school and continue working directly with families in a frontline capacity. So while I explored graduate programs, social work really stood out to me because of the holistic lens. And what drew me in was the understanding that a person is never just their symptoms. They're shaped by relationships, identity, environment, culture, and lived experience. And so I also had a very meaningful experience with a social worker during my undergrad degree when I had a recent diagnosis of ADHD. And it was really helpful and showed me how impactful the profession could be. So social work has allowed me to integrate everything that I care about, really clinical practice, research, advocacy, prevention, community building into one profession that's grounded in connection. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. So diving a little bit more into the work that you do. So for folks who are listening or watching, some of the things that I mentioned, Julie and I discussed in our discovery call together, but we'll explain everything. So as we discussed, grief and loss have been very central themes throughout your career. Can you walk us through some of the defining moments, both personal and professional, that shaped your focus on grief support and how it influences the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. So grief has really been woven into kind of every stage of my career. Early on, I supported individuals and families who were facing medical trauma, end of life transitions, and ambiguous loss through hospice work and at victim services. And what stood out to me very quickly was how little structured grief supports actually existed, especially for young people, is really what I noticed. And so many of the individuals that I worked with felt isolated in their grief or pressured to be strong for others. And so they often weren't sure where their grief belonged or whether it was even allowed to take up space. And then professionally, I've kind of become known as someone who, wasn't afraid to sit with hard emotions. And personally, I experienced losses, and they've really deepened my understanding of what grief support truly needs to look like. Not quick fixes and timelines, but presence, compassion, creativity, community. And those experiences shaped my belief that grief really needs to be witnessed, not pathologized. And that belief continues to really shape my work today.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. And I know when we were chatting a little while ago, we talked about how you experienced significant loss of your mother and how that was an important moment in your journey. If you don't mind sharing with us, how that loss influenced your decision to start your own practice and just how the way that you run your practice and all the things that it involves. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So losing my mom to pancreatic cancer was definitely the most defining moment in my life to date. It really reshaped not only how I understand grief, but also how I show up as a therapist, a business owner, and just a general human. So Willow Tree Wellness and Psychotherapy, it's named in her honor. We kind of created that together in a hospital visit. that we shared, and I wanted the practice to reflect the qualities that she embodied. So compassion, authenticity, growth, adaptability. And one very tangible way her loss shaped my practice is through the creation of a bereavement leave fund for my team. So I wanted to build the kind of workplace supports that I wish that I had more of: paid space to grieve, to attend appointments, settle estates, or simply breathe. There's really like a business aspect to grief that comes afterwards, and it can be really taxing. And social workers are caregivers by nature, and we often push through our own pain. And I wanted my clinic culture to be the opposite of that. So that's why we offer a one-time $1,000 bereavement support for therapists who lose an immediate family member. And it's just a practical way of saying your pain matters, you're human, and you don't have to navigate this alone. And so her death also reinforced my belief that community matters more than productivity. And that belief led me to launch a free 6-week grief workshop that landed over the holidays. And I'm 4 weeks into it right now. And participants have described it so far as, feeling seen, understood, less alone, sometimes lighter, sometimes heavier, but supported. And that response affirmed just how many people are grieving quietly without adequate support sometimes.
Wow. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I really resonate with just a lot of what you were saying. I think, first of all, thank you for your amazing work, and being able to offer that to the folks that you work with, I think is so important, especially because in a lot of workspaces, because there are things like the bereavement leave, but it all feels very structural and system focused. It just doesn't feel like there's no human in it. It's just something that is mandated. So, going beyond to, it is true, there's a lot of financial stuff that come with loss, as you mentioned, like even planning a funeral and like supporting the people that need support and so and so. So I definitely think, I hope that more spaces can provide support like that for people who work with them, because it is important. And when we're dealing with grief and loss, we forget to take care of ourselves. We're most of the time taking care of other people and all that stuff. So I definitely think that's important. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that with us. I want to dive in a little bit into your work and the way that you work. I know we talked a lot about the type of therapy that you offer, especially because much of your work focuses on working with children and teens, workshops and things like that. If you could share with us, how do the creative modalities that you use help young people process grief, and why is it important to offer multiple ways of expression and healing?
Yeah, absolutely. So children and teens, they don't grieve in straight lines. I mean, nor do adults, but they really grieve in bursts. And so through play, movement, art, storytelling, imagination, sensory experiences, all those things are really important to include. So creative approaches like directive play therapy, like art therapy, narrative work, expressive tools help reduce the pressure for them to sort of find the right words. Instead, they offer young people a sense of control, a safe emotional distance from some of the overwhelming feelings, and ways to express emotions that they don't necessarily have the language for. And I often use metaphor, games, stories. We do sand tray activities, art activities, values based activities. I'm currently taking the death, grief, and loss bereavement certificate through Laurier University, and I've been learning a lot of amazing resources through there. So just activities to share their story and develop continuing bonds with their loved ones or their person who has passed, and build emotional skills in a developmentally appropriate way. And every young person needs more than one doorway into healing, and grief support should never be one size fits all. It should meet the child and teen where they're at. And this extends beyond the typical loss of a loved one. This could also be, more disenfranchised grief or ambiguous grief of going through a divorce or moving schools or changes in identity and things of that nature.
Thank you for highlighting that, because that is something that, a lot of the times we just don't think about. But it is important, because it's a change, and yeah, like with every loss, change happens. And as you mentioned, even like with divorce, it may not even just be, the person has necessarily passed away, but they're no longer in your life in a specific way, and they might have been part of life for a long time, or that sort of thing. Thank you for highlighting that. I know in general, when we think about grief, a lot of people struggle where to turn when they're grieving. Understanding, as you mentioned, it's not a one size fits all. Understanding, grieving, and especially during moments where there's crisis or transition, as we talked about. In your perspective, what barriers exist when it comes to accessing grief support? And if you can think of a vision for what creating something that is more accessible and, easier to navigate as far as grief resources and care, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think I was really hit at this moment where I attended this. It was hosted by this group called the Parentless Club. And so they hosted a Motherless Day event. And so I attended, and this was all 18 plus. And, I met together with a whole bunch of individuals who had lost their mom. And it was this really like community based, I found it healing experience. But one shared thing that was coming up amongst everyone was kind of like, they didn't know where to turn. Like they felt they needed support, but they had no idea where to get it. And so I think that one of the biggest barriers to grief support is simply knowing where to start. And at a time when you have very limited capacity and are already feeling overwhelmed, it's not the time to start kind of digging and trying to figure it out yourself. So services are fragmented, and there are hospital programs, there's private practices, there's peer support groups, victim services, funeral homes, spiritual supports. They all exist. It's just there's not really a clear roadmap of where you may go first, and do I need a referral, and how long is the wait list, and things like that. So I think other barriers too include stigma around grief lasting too long. There can be financial limitations, long wait lists. I find that there's a lack of youth specific services, fear of burdening others, and just uncertainty about what kind of support is even needed. And so my vision is to create a centralized Ontario wide grief support map as an easy to navigate directory that helps families find free and low cost grief resources, child and teen programs, crisis supports, cultural and spiritual care, specialized clinicians, and peer communities. Grief shouldn't really require this detective work. Support should feel accessible, compassionate, and clear. And so I'm currently also exploring grant funding to our free 6-week grief workshop, just in hopes that I can run it multiple times a year, not just over the holidays. And one statistic that really stayed with me is that unresolved grief is estimated to cost, this is a US statistic, but 100 billion annually in lost productivity in healthcare. So while grief is hard to quantify, especially everyday losses like divorce, illness, identity shifts, its impact is emotional, physical, relational, and generational. So really big impacts when we aren't supported.
Yeah, wow. That's a big number. Oh my gosh. This is personal for me, but also I think people might find they might be interested in this. Would you mind sharing a little bit, if you could just walk us through the program that you offer through the holidays, just a little bit more about it for folks who might be interested?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's structured in a 6-week weekly basis. We actually did take a small break just because one of the sessions lined up over Christmas. That we come together. There's 8 of us. We've had different session topics. And so one of the ones that I think really stood out to me is we actually had an opportunity to bring in an item and or photo that reminded us of, I'm really careful with the language, not just loved one. Sometimes I say our person that we lost, because I want to also acknowledge that some folks in the group, they have really complex losses where they've lost an individual and they're also grieving the relationship that they wish that they had with that individual. So I don't make assumptions on what the connection was. For some people it feels like it's their loved one, and for other people it's the person that they lost, and regardless of how close that relationship was, nonetheless impacted by them. And so we've had also kind of some somatic and mindfulness practices based in IFS, internal family systems therapy, where we're coming in and we're really speaking to that grief part and what it needs, and to be witnessed and to be seen. And I think that that's been something that's really nice. We also use some different somatic activities to help ground us in this space. So whether that's being able to kind of go through and practice like our butterfly hugs, or practice like the visualization, 5 4 3 2 1 grounding, all of those things, just to make sure that individuals are feeling resourced. We've also kind of reviewed some scripts to build a little bit of confidence on what might we say around the holiday season if we're feeling we're at capacity, and is it okay for us to actually decline going to an event if we're just not up to it that day, and also being able to ask when we may need support and what that support might look like. So I think it's been really amazing so far, and we have three sessions left, so I'm looking forward to it.
Wow, it really does sound amazing. And I think it's so important that you offer that during the holidays, especially because for a lot of people, that's a lonely time, like, and seeing people, even if it's like on social media, everyone with their families, little Christmas photo shoots, it emphasizes that like loneliness or that loss, because everyone else is with their families and things like that. So I think it's definitely important to offer during the holidays for sure. I was wondering as you were talking, is there an emphasis or a section in any of your work that focuses specifically on like things like pet loss and grief regarding like losing pets and things like that?
I haven't done any specific training that is specific to pets, but I would say the training that I have done can certainly extend to different types of loss. Pet loss, divorce. We've worked with families who have had miscarriages, stillbirths, things like that. So I haven't done a specific group. Certainly, if there was an interest for that, that could be interesting. I know that there is a hospice nearby out in Oshawa that actually does offer a pet specific grief and loss group. So there's absolutely a need for that for sure. And for many people, their pet is a really big companion. And for some, it's actually their closest companion. So that loss is definitely something that needs to be acknowledged for sure.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Thank you. So before we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work with OASW, because I think that was more like the policy stuff that you're doing, and I want to kind of touch on all the little things. So as we mentioned in our conversation, you had an internship with OASW, and your work in policy gave you a broader view of how social work can influence systems and amplify the voices of students and clients. Can you share a little bit about that experience and just how it continues to shape the way that you practice your advocacy and the way that you lead today?
Yeah, so working with OASW early in my career gave me a systems level perspective on social work, and I saw firsthand how policy influences access funding, practice standards, and just the public's understanding as well as our profession. And I think that that's something that's really important. It taught me the importance of amplifying client and student voices. I was able to have the opportunity to serve on the student advisory committee for 2 years there, and that was really meaningful work. And just using research to inform advocacy and recognizing that even small policy changes can have really big, meaningful real world impacts. And so the perspective continues to shape my work today, from building fair workplace policies to creating accessible programs, prioritizing professional development within my team. That's something that we're really working to do on a regular basis, and mentoring emerging social workers and advocating for better grief resources. So yeah, it was very impactful, that experience.
I love that. I love that you're able to get so much of it. And I think it's so important when, especially as a leader, when the things that you learn, even when you're starting out early, are till today influencing the way that you work and the way that you advocate and you support folks. So I'm glad that you're able to do that internship and it had such an impact on you, because I'm sure a lot of people are grateful for the way that it supports your work. So as we kind of wrap up a little bit, I like to end the episodes in a little bit of visioning, imagining, because our theme is reflecting on our past and reimagining our future. And so as we look ahead and reflect on CSW's 100 years, what lessons, if you think from your work in grief and loss and in other work that you're doing, do you hope to be carried forward in the profession? And in particular, what approaches would you like to see strengthened when it comes to supporting individuals navigating profound transitions and loss?
Yeah. So looking ahead, I would love to see grief treated as a universal human experience rather than this more clinical problem to be fixed and rushed and given a timeline. I hope the profession continues moving towards integrative, culturally responsive practices, greater accessibility, trauma and attachment informed workplaces, and stronger grief literacy overall. One big dream that I have that feels really big but deeply important is bringing grief education into schools across Ontario, because children grieve differently than adults and often quietly without the language, yet school-based grief supports can be minimal because it's usually crisis driven. And I remember having my experience of doing a placement in the Toronto District School Board, and the social workers there were amazing, and they would sometimes have 5 to 6 schools that they were responsible for. So oftentimes it's really just putting out fires and not always having the capacity to support the students who are coming in with grief and loss related concerns. So I kind of imagine a grief informed classroom where there's teachers training and small school-based grief groups, clear referral pathways, and developmentally appropriate supports from kindergarten all the way to grade 12. And I don't know yet the exact pathway or funding model, but I think that this is something that's undeniably needed. And if we can continue building a profession where grief is supported rather than stigmatized, then I think we'll be carrying the very best of social work into the next 100 years.
That was very well said. Thank you for that. 100% agree. I think grief, loss, transitions are one of the few things that everyone experiences. So it should be given priority when it comes to education and special attention to, because I find that with things like grief, there's so much need for, especially with young people, there's so much need for education and support, but then there's so few people who have that expertise because it's, as with everything, it's underfunded, people are overworked, all that stuff. So I think in adding to your vision and your hope for the next 100 years, I would say just, yeah, like investing more into education on how to support young people, how best to support young people, because yeah, grief is hard, and when you don't have the support, or when the person that is supporting you doesn't really understand how best to support you, then it just kind of, it makes it feel more lonely. As someone who's experienced a lot of grief as well in my life, I can definitely attest to that on a personal level. So yeah, thank you for that. Um, Before I conclude our episode, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to share, about yourself, about your work, anything that's come up for you.
Um, I think today was pretty comprehensive, but I guess just that I really view it as an opportunity to wake up and get to do this type of work. And it's really interesting because I had an interest in grief and loss work before I had any personal experience of loss, and it's definitely just deepened my level of understanding and I think empathy and compassion that I can bring to the work. And that's not to say that you need to experience grief and loss to be an amazing social worker who can provide grief resources. But I think that it's something that I'm just really passionate about and honored that I get to honored that I get to do. So thank you, Esther.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julia, for sharing your story, your compassion, and the thoughtful ways that you've worked to transform grief support. I think, I can tell that this is very personal for you, and I see in the way that you speak about it and the way that you talk about your work. And I think your work reminds us that social work is not only about intervention, but there's care, presence, systems that honor people and their most vulnerable moments, and just kind of create space for people to just feel and be held. So thank you for that, and thank you for your work. As we continue to celebrate 100 years of CSW, your perspective, I think, helps brighten or illuminate a future where grief is met with understanding and creativity too, because there's so many ways to process and express. So thank you once again for sharing this insights, and I really hope that people who are listening or watching are leaving this episode with a gem or two that can support them in their practice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esther. And I think a lot of it too, I think it's just really important to note, of course, as social workers, those who are in private practice or, working in hospital systems or organizations, for sure, a lot of the responsibility, yes, it falls on us, but I think it's also in terms of funding, obviously falling back to provincial, federal government and things like that, of just focusing on where we need the resources for the supports as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you to our listeners or viewers for joining us, for tuning in. We'll be back with more conversations highlighting the people shaping the next century of social work in Canada. All right, bye.